Hello everybody and welcome to the Quilters Apothecary. I've been getting a lot of requests about how I load my quilts on the Innova. So today I thought I would go ahead and do a quick tutorial of how I do it. Now there are a bunch of different ways to load your machine. And we can refer to full floats when you let the quilt top hang down, or pinning onto the leader as one of them. You can also utilize different tools like the red snappers or the leader grip products. A lot of people also like to have zippers sewn to their leaders, so then they're always pinning to the end of a zipper, and then they can take off the quilt and put it on as they see fit. Today I'm simply going to be doing just a very basic pin on. I've been pinning forever, and I've been doing this over 20 years. I like it. I know it's a bit primitive for a lot of people, but I find that gives me the opportunity, when I load a quilt the traditional way by pinning it onto my leaders and rolling it on, and I'll show you the method that I use to do it. What it gives me is the opportunity to get to know my quilt. I want to know if I'm going to have issues with fullness, if I'm going to have issues with tent blocks that we deal with a lot of the times. And for me, loading a quilt the traditional way is my kind of an introduction. It's like speed dating, but it's with a quilt, and it helps me get to know that quilt so I know what to do in the future as I'm quilting through it to have it be quilted properly. So let's go to the machine and I'm going to show you how I do that. Okay, so here we are at the back of the machine. Now what I've done so far is I've oiled my machine the way that I do before I do any quilt. Anytime I start a quilt, I do a nice full oil on the machine based on whatever brand you'd have. You would do it your way. The next thing I do is I like to clean my rails real well. Typically I'm doing some more high-end custom quilts. So a quilt has been on my machine, the wheels have gone back and forth a lot, and between each quilt I like to go ahead and I have a tutorial up on that, on how to clean the rails on my table as well as my carriage. So I've done that. Everything is ready to go. I've cleared off the back of my machine whenever I start another quilt, and this one's going to be on a while because it's pretty high-end custom. I want to make sure to start fresh and clean. So I've done all that. The next thing I'm going to do is I would lay out my quilt back across my machine, and then I would lay my quilt top on. And the reason that I do that is so that I can guarantee that the backing is big enough. My rule of thumb is minimum 8 inches wider and 8 inches longer, and anything less and I'm going to end up sewing strips onto whatever side is short, and that's just a have to do for me because I don't want to have to deal with running into clamps, and so I like a little bit wider. So the next thing I'm going to do before we start loading is I'm going to grab my leader. And this is where I start to pin first, is the back roller. And what I'm going to do is bring it under and over, all the way down. And I'm going to pull that leader right over and get that nice and smooth. And the next thing we're going to do is grab our quilt back and bring it over to the machine. I have the quilt back as well as the quilt top over the frame of the machine, and what I've done is I've checked all 4 sides to make sure I have a minimum of 4 inches. For me personally, I want 8 inches wider and 8 inches longer before I even load the backing on the machine. The other thing is I will never load a back on my machine anymore without it being pre-washed. There's so much sizing on the fabric now that if it's not pre-washed, instead of spreading the fibers when the needle goes through, what you actually do is you punch through the fabric and it leaves the back looking horrible. Frankly, I don't like it, but I find that if I pre-wash the back, I just don't have that trouble. Everything's soft and ready to take the needle through properly. So I've checked all 4 sides. I have plenty of room. If I didn't have enough room on the sides, I would simply sew on strips of muslin or fabric that I would find in my studio, but we're ready to go. I actually have some extra fabric on this beautiful piece. This is a Judy Niemeyer vintage rose, and it was pieced, and it is owned by Martha Hahn from Houston, Texas, and it's pieced wonderfully, so it's perfectly flat. So it's going to be a pleasure to have this on the machine for the 3 weeks that it's going to be on to do all of the detail work in it. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my quilt top, now that I know it's organized, I don't want to do any shifting. I want everything to stay in place before I actually load the backing and the quilt top. So while I have everything and I know where it's going to go, I'm going to fold my quilt top in half and put a pin right in the middle. And what I do is I have different colored pins. I'm just using the flower head pins. So I have a system that I use white for top and bottom. And then if I'm going to mark the sides, like let's say I'm going to do a border treatment that I need to know where the middle of the sides is at, then I would go ahead and I would fold the sides and I would use a different color pin so that when I go to load my quilt top, I'm not going to get confused and load it turned around. And you have to kind of figure out your own system for that. So again, I fold in half. I've located the bottom and top. And then I have also folded in half the backing itself. And I have a pin to signify where it's going to be pinned to the middle of the leader. So the next thing is we're going to actually start pinning on the back. Okay, so I have my back all smoothed out. Now, as my backing is leaning across, I always do this double check because I had to take out a whole quilt years ago because I had the back on, I loaded it, and I didn't even catch it because it was a similar batik like this. Sometimes with batiks and certain backings, if they're pieced, you can't tell which side is the right side or the wrong side, and I loaded the whole thing and quilted it with the seams on the outside. I know that's horrible, it sounds silly, but I actually did it. So just always double check to make sure that you have the wrong side facing up. And then I line up my pin right in the middle. I'm going to take my flower head out, and I like to pin on my backing with these corsage pins. And I locate the middle and I put it in. A lot of people, when using the pins, are going to do this in, out, in, and out. I don't do that. That's going to distort the back. I prefer to do one in, get a nice big chunk, and then out. Now, as I work my way from the center out to this edge, which is what I'm going to do, and then when I finish that, I'm going to work my way from the center out to this edge. What I want to do is I'm going to skip. I don't do head to tail. I think that takes in and causes fullness and ruffling in the edges. So I like to go every few inches with no pin and then hit with the next pin. So it keeps that quilt backing nice and smooth. And I'm going to work my way right down to the end. Line it up. Now, when I'm doing this, I line it up. I have my finger. The edge of the back goes right to the edge of the leader. And as I do that, and I slide my finger down, I do not stretch this fabric. I want to make sure it's nice and smooth. If I notice any fullness, I want to work it in evenly. Now with this one, I don't have any of that. Line it up, pin, line it up, go about 1.5 inches, 2 inches away. It's just an eyeball thing. Okay, now I am almost all the way to the end, and as I'm at the end here, I want to make sure that my pin goes right into that 1/4 inch just before the backing ends. And that way I know that it's nice and stable and it's not going to flip up on me. So now once I get that done, I'm going to come down and we're going to start in the middle again, and I'm going to work my way out to the edge. By the way, when I'm doing this, you'll notice that, of course, I'm pinning into the leader side first and then going through this. One of the reasons that I like to do that is because when this gets rolled up, the pins are inside the roll. I'm not going to be rubbing my hands across and nailing my hand with the pins. So that's another reason that I like to do it this way. Now I'm almost to the edge, and again, I want to make sure that that pin is right within a 1/4 inch of the edge of that quilt. Back, right there, right in there, in, and then I've got a little bit of space here, and I always like to tie that space up so that it's nice and stable, at least on this side as well as the other side. Anywhere you get near an edge, I want to make sure that it's stable. Okay, so now the next step. Okay, so now I'm going to take this and I'm going to drop it down and I'm going to start rolling. Now, as I'm rolling, again, I have the backing off the end of the machine and I have it pretty smooth over there, and the weight is keeping it nice and smooth as I roll it up. So I'm going to kind of be running from this end to this end and making sure that it's rolled up nice and smooth. And notice how I don't have any pins sticking out here to grab me. So now as I roll up, I'm going to slide down here. The one thing I never do is the weird snake bite thing that a lot of people do. They'll be rolling up a quilt and they'll be doing this. We don't want to do this. We move our hands this way and this way. And that way what we're doing is we are letting the fullness be natural and we are not causing fullness. We're smoothing out our back as we go. Now this time, as I'm rolling this quilt up, I actually have my seams not perpendicular to the leaders. They're actually going down lengthwise. And with that, I want to make sure as I come to the seams to keep those nice and smooth. Typically when people piece their backs, they will tend to do a little bit of stretching, so these can be a little stretched out. I find that actually probably about 75% of the time. So as I'm rolling this up, I'm just coming to where those seams are, and that is the only exception that I will have to the snake bite thing. I just want to make sure that these aren't being puckered in and sucked up into the fullness of the relaxed fabric. Now when I come from side to side, because this backing was sewn so well, or if I had a backing that had been ripped rather than cut, I want to make sure that this is nice and even on both sides. And before I actually loaded this back, I actually folded it into quarters to make sure that it was nice and square. You know, you can't always depend that a backing is going to be square, and you can do your best to square it, and sometimes you just end up dealing with what they give you. And that's part of what we do. You make it work, which is why I tend to like a little bit extra fabric in my backings. Okay, so I'm pretty well rolled. Now I'm going to go to the other side and I'm going to pin on the bottom portion of my backing. Okay, so now I'm just going to take this and I'm going to just let it drop down into the gutter of the table here. And this is my backing roller from the other side. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to drop it down like this. Both directions. And then I'm going to grab my backing, bring it up and over, and pull it. And I like to pull it so that the edge rests right against this leader. And remember, double check that you have the right leader. You don't want to pin it to the quilt top leader. So in all these years, I think I've done it probably about 10 or 15 times. So it's going to happen, but you'll start to get that muscle memory of how not to let it happen. And that is double check everything as you work. Bring this down. Now, because I let it rest when I dropped it down there, it straightened itself out. Now as I pull back, here's once in a while what you're going to find with a lot of the backings that have been pieced or ripped. And sometimes when people rip both sides of their backing, because a lot of the shops do not rip, they actually cut, and so it's hard to have a nice square back. What a lot of people will do is when they rip, the fabric is not going to stay on grain. What it'll do is, even though it's even and perfect, it does this through the rip. And so what you do is, if you notice when you fold it in quarters that it's a little off and it's not perfectly square if both sides have been ripped, what I do is, let's say this is the backing, I'll have Rich grab this top part and I'll grab this bottom part so it's on the diagonal like this, and then I'll have him pull this end and I will pull the bottom end, and what it does is it pulls it back into square, and then that way it's nice and even on your machine. Okay, so now I have this hanging off. And how that applies here is there are occasions when it's not a rip back, it could be a cut back, and by the time you roll this back on, my middle pin is off about an inch. It's not hitting exactly in that middle spot, but I have 4 or 5 inches on this particular backing on both sides, so I'm not really worried about it. I would rather have it off, just because this backing, that tends to be the natural lay of it, rather than to take this pin, for example, and line it up with the middle. Do you see what's happening? If I were to line this up, you see how I'm getting this going on here? And I don't want that. So because I know I have enough backing, I want it nice and smooth, and that does mean I'm going to be off the center just a little bit. So I'm going to line that up. Put my first pin in, and now I'm going to work the same way. And again, when I'm putting these pins in, I'm going through the leader into the front. That way when I roll it up, my pins are in the leader and I'm not going to run my hand over it when I'm smoothing out as I roll throughout the quilt and nail myself. Pin to bone does not feel good. So let's pin it from the middle out both ways. Again, I line up that fabric, smooth my hand down, and pin. Line up the fabric, line it, make sure I'm not stretching all the way down to the end. And again, I leave about 1.5 inches to 2 inches of space. I have my last pin in within 1/4 inch from the edge. Now I come to the center, and now I'm going to work from the center that way, all the way down. I'm going to drop that down into the table gutter. Roll that up. Now, here's what I want you to see. We have fullness on this side, and we have nice and taut in the center, and we have a little bit of fullness on this side. So the next thing I'm going to do to alleviate that problem is I'm going to roll this back and forth 3 full times. I'm going to roll it all the way up on this roller, all the way back on that roller, all the way back. And again, if I have any fullness here, I'll do it until it's nice and smooth. And the max I've ever had to do it to get it nice and smooth and perfect and flat all the way through is about 3 times. Okay, so that was my 3rd time, and you can see the back is nice and smooth. I've got a nice flat back, and now I'm ready to load my quilt top. And I do load my quilt top before I put my batting in. Okay, so now I have my quilt top over the machine. I've got that lined up. I'm centered with my pin that I put in there. And let me take off my leader clamps. I like to have my leader clamps on when I'm not using the machine. That way things don't get caught in the roller. And as I'm rolling up the back, nothing gets wound in. Okay, I'm going to bring that down. And for my quilt top, I like to use flower head pins. I find that they're a little more gentle, and as they roll up, it distorts the quilt top less. Okay, I'm going to line that up. The pin is right there in the center. And again, just like with the backing, I am pinning through the leader side first. That way when I roll it up, the pins are in the leader. And I work my way from the center out. And just like when we loaded the backing fabric, I slide down. I go about an inch, inch and a half before I put my pin in. I keep my edge of my quilt top right on the edge of my leader. That keeps my quilt nice and square. And I really kind of need to add as square as the quilt was pieced. There are things we have no control over. That is one of them. I always remind my clients, if you bring me an hourglass shaped quilt, you're going to get one back. Not everything quilts out, it quilts in. I'm here towards the end. I'm going to slide this down, line that up. Remember, I never stretch my fibers. I lay it nice and smooth. Unless what? The only exception to that would be this. Let's say when I was doing my take-in, when I actually took in the quilt, what I always like to do once I take a quilt top in is, and it's usually while the client is there unless it's been shipped to me, and then what I'll do is if it's been shipped to me, I try to within 48 hours go ahead, take the quilt out, and I inspect it. I would take this quilt top and I would fold it in quarters to see how square it was. And if it's an hourglass quilt, what I would know then is that along the edges where it does that I'm going to have a little bit longer here, and as I roll this onto the leader, I'll know that there's going to be a little bit of give on both sides. And again, even though I'm going to stretch that just a little, when I say stretch, I use that term pretty lightly. I don't stretch, so that it's straight on as I load it. There's still going to be a little bit of hourglass because I don't want to quilt that stretched into shape. And then if they hang it at a show, what'll happen is those edges where I've stretched it are going to boing right out, and it's going to start to bowl a little bit. So again, like I said, when I receive a quilt, I want to fold it in quarters to know kind of what I'm going to be dealing with. In this case, I know that when I roll this on, as you're going to see, it's going to be almost exactly perfect because she's an amazing piecer. But if I noticed that there was a little bit of hourglassing going on as I would be loading this quilt top, I would make sure not only not to stretch it, but actually just a smidge of fullness as I'm pinning, kind of work it through evenly so that I can kind of help a little bit with that stretched fabric that can end up being pieced into our clients' quilts when they piece them. Okay, we're going to go back to the middle and we're going to work our way out from the middle to the other edge. Okay, so now I have my quilt top nice and smooth. I'm going to start to roll it up onto the roller. Now, as I'm doing this, one of the things that I want to point out is that I have no batting loaded on here yet. If I had batting loaded on, what would happen is I would be distorting the batting. I prefer to do my batting at the very end once the quilt top is rolled onto the roller. Now, I'm going to go down to one side, and what I'm going to do, it's very natural for us to want to pull up like this to get this nice and smooth. That's a problem. You don't want to do that. What you actually want to do, because borders just by nature are going to have a little bit of fullness in them. So what I do is I pull my fullness into my roller to keep it consistent. Pull it in, make sure my edge is nice and smooth. Now I'm going to run down to the other end, and again, I don't do any twisting, no snake bite. I want to go straight across as I'm rolling, except for at the edges, where I want to work that fullness into the roller. Do not pull the fullness out, otherwise you will get to the top and you will have a smiley face. I'm checking for tucks. This is where, if I did have any hourglassing going on, I would want to center it. So if I had a little bit of stuff going on here where it was going in, I'd want to make sure that on this end, I would have that going on. So you keep it centered, and that quilt would be as square as you could possibly get it. I don't have a lot of that going on with this quilt, but I am working in my fullness. Work it in, no smiley faces. Now, I just drop it down, get it out of the way. Roll it the rest of the way on my roller. Lock my end. And now, I'm going to add my batting. And for this particular piece, I am going to be double batting it. So we're going to have a layer of the 80-20 towards the back, which is going to help this quilt to hang straight because I am doing higher end custom on this one. In case she ever wants to hang it on a wall, it'll hang nice and straight. And then to the top, typically my first choice would be a wool on the top. But on this one, because we have some really light and we have a few bits of white in here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a white poly. That way it's not going to dull any of the white fabric that's in the quilt top. Okay, so my first bat that I'm going to put down towards the backing is going to be 80-20, and in this case it's Hobbs 80-20. I believe if you had Dream it would be 70-30. One of the things I want to add is, since this 80-20 is going towards the back, I look at both sides whenever I'm using the combo batting. And what I'm going to be looking for is pilling. Which side has the pilling? When I say pilling, I'm talking about like an old sweater that's been washed a lot. Those little pills, you'll get those little hard pills, or something that looks like hard pills. And I'm going to find the side that has those. And once you find that, and in this case it happens to be the inside of the fold, then notice the other side is going to be a little bit more smooth. The pilling side faces up all the time. And I've had people that sell me batting, and I've actually had the batting people proper tell me, well, there's no difference to either side. Malarkey. There is a difference, and you look for the pilling, and the pilling faces up. Pimples up, dimples down. We always want to remember that. And on that one, follow that rule. I know that there are a few people saying it's opposite, and very few times will I say this, they're wrong. You want that pilling facing up. If you don't have this pilling facing up and you have it towards the back, then when your needle hits it, it can go through the backing, and that will give you bearding, and you don't want to have bearding on the back of your quilt. Sometimes you can't help it because of the backing itself, but you don't want it to be because you had your batting wrong side, right side. Okay? All right. So we're going to take this. My pilling faces up. Line this up. Obviously, I want my batting to be a bit larger than my quilt top. Now, it doesn't have to be as wide as your backing, obviously, but I definitely want it wider than my quilt top proper. Okay. And we are fortunate with the Innova to have, get this up out of the way, our batting access bar. Drop this down. And one of these evenings, while I'm sitting in front of the TV, I need to get one of the patterns for the batting hammocks, so that way the batting can rest in the hammock rather than on the floor. Now, before I load a quilt, I always run a vacuum around my machine. That way I can pick up any of the dark threads. So I'm not going to, while I'm loading my quilt, roll up those dark threads that can sometimes be seen through when you look through the light parts of the fabric. And I've done that this time. So we've got that. And let me lower that. Lower that. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tighten the backing. And then I'm going to do a sew line with my channel locks in place about a ½ inch down from the edge of the leader. I'm just going to put my channel locks on, and I'm going to do a line straight across so that way this batting is stable and in place. And when I load the other batting and pull my quilt top up to it, it's not going to shift and change on me. And I have a straight line to work towards. Okay, so I have my stitch regulator on 4 stitches per inch, and I'm going to go across because I certainly don't want to go across at anything higher than, frankly, 6 or 7 stitches per inch. I want my batting to lay nice and smooth. And if I do short stitches or more stitches per inch, then I'm going to be taking in my batting a little bit and causing some distortion. Now I've loaded my second batting, and in this case it's a polyester bat to add a nice loft to show off the quilting, because what I want is a kind of a faux trapunto look when I quilt this quilt. So I've got that laying across here. I put a few pins down just like that. I go down here, lock my stitches, and I came down about a ½ inch below the straight line that I put on the first bat. Okay, so that shot right there shows you, remember, our leaders, no matter what kind of leaders you have, whether you have gotten them from Innova proper or whether you have made your own, leaders are fabric, and you can't trust that leader to be a straight line. And so the straight line that we've sewn on top of our batting is the line that you actually want to use to bring your quilt to give you a true line. So let's go ahead and let's pin our quilt top to the true line, and then I'll show you how I like to baste my edge of my quilt as I quilt. Next, what I'm going to do is I want to stabilize the edge of my quilt. All of our LongArm machines come with their own brand of clamps, which are wonderful. The one thing that I know though is that when I clamp to something, I want a nice stable hold that's going to keep it firm. We use two different things in the studio. We have the red snapper side clamps, which go on the quilt, or the leader grip side clamps, which go on the quilt. And for our 26-inch, we actually use the leader grips because we have the longer set of those. So I'm going to line that up. I do my center, snap that out, and then I'm going to take my clamp and I just go right around the grip itself. So now when I make this taunt, that's going to keep perfect tension throughout the whole throat space of my machine. Okay, I've got everything going here. I'm going to unlock my roller, extend that up, past the sew line, roll it back, and then I'm going to line it up right up to the line. And again, I know that I have loaded it on my roller nice and straight. My middle pin might not line up right in that middle. It all depends on the quilt top piecing itself. What I'm looking for is nice smooth lines. And seeing that, I line up my edge. And in this case, that lined up pretty darn close to that middle. It's off like 1/4 of an inch. And I'm going to trust the true of the smoothness. Now I'm going to pop over to the other side. I'm going to put a pin in the middle, and then I'm going to put a pin on both sides, and then I'm going to put a pin in between there, so that way when I sew down base the edge of my quilt, I know that everything's lined up perfect. Okay, I come down to the end of my machine, I check my true, and it's pretty true. It's got a nice straight line. I also check some of the seams in the quilt, and visually for me, they look really nice. I'm not sure about your camera angle, but everything looks really nice and in line. Now I'm going to go down and I'm going to baste the edge of my quilt. And there's a few different ways I could do that. One of the ways I could do that is start from the center and go out. And again, I am only going to be using basting stitches, so about 4 stitches per inch. And then I'll come back after I do across that half of the top, and I will start here and I will go out this way. If it's a really straight quilt and you get used to doing this, you can start at that end and you can go all the way over to the end. Here is what you don't want to do, I suggest, especially for my new folks. You don't want to start down here in your throat space and then come up, over, and down. What I like to do is get my top first, so I'm dealing with all the fullness so I have a nice straight top. And then I'll do the sides from the bottom of the throat space up. That way I'm not coming down and I'm not working fullness down into the body of my quilt with my basting. Okay, so now I've locked my stitches and now I'm going to head all the way across with this particular quilt. And I am staying within 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the quilt. I'm working the fullness in as I go. That's something you're going to have to kind of develop a little bit of hand-eye coordination. And make sure not to get your fingers near the needle. If you don't trust yourself, then simply put in more pins across before you start, and then you don't have to maneuver as much as you work your way across. And again, your binding is going to cover that edge. And here's the thing, I love basting this edge because I'll tell you what, it makes binding this quilt so much easier when you have a nice stable base right across the top and up the sides. I find you get less ruffling with the bindings, and piecers really love it when they can sew on that binding and have that edge basted down. Okay, so now for my sides, I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to put a few little basting pins in all the way up. So probably for this, about 3 pins. I'm just going to line this up. I'm going to go down to the edge of the roller, make sure I'm nice and straight. 1, 2, 3. And now, rather than starting at the top up here and working down, I want to come to the bottom of my throat space. Lock my stitches. And then I'm going to head up. And again, I'm going about 1/8 of an inch in from the edge. And now I'm easing fullness in every roll so that way I'm not pushing fullness down toward the top. I'm distributing it evenly through my whole quilt. And now we're going to do that on the other side. Okay, so now my next step would be to do my ditch work between the body and the main border of the quilt. That way I'm going to stabilize that before I start doing the work in the border itself. And then as I move down the quilt, what I would do is every time I roll, as I do my quilting down the quilt, I would then go ahead and before I start anything, I'm going to baste from the bottom of the throat space up so that every edge of this quilt, the edge is basted down as I quilt down the whole quilt. And obviously there are many different ways to do that next. You can do all of the quilting in the whole throat space before you roll. Some people will go ahead and do their ditch work and then add a little bit of basting stitches in the big open areas and roll, and then ditch down the whole thing and then come back and do their filler work. And no matter what way you do it, this is how I load a quilt, and this is how I keep my edges basted as I work my way down. I hope that helps for some of you that like to do it this traditional way. So there we go. Have a wonderful time quilting and be good to each other. What do you think about that, girl? You know, I gotta train you how to do this. Then I can quilt more and you can load all of my quilts.